Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Jeffrey Rogg, who's a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute, as well as the vice president of Society for Intelligence History of North America. Full disclosure, I'm also a member of that organization. Dr. Rogg, before we begin delving into your new book, which deals with a full, with the history of the American intelligence, and it's called The Spy and the State. Could you tell us a little bit about your roles in these organizations and what made you decide to focus on that particular topic?
Absolutely, and thank you, Rena. So I'm in a different place in intelligence studies than some of our other members in, for instance, the Society for Intelligence History, in that I don't have a background in the intelligence community. So, I strictly entered intelligence studies on the basis of, I guess, the same fascination that a lot of other people have. Now, I did always have interest in national security. I was enlisted in the U.S. military very briefly, for 6 years in the Mass Guard. And that was because in response to 9/11, like in other words, the interest was there. And my PhD was in military and diplomatic history. But I discovered intelligence studies at Georgetown University in my master's program. And it was almost by accident. When I started the program, you have concentrations to choose from. And one of the concentrations was intelligence. And this is why I love intelligence studies. I love intelligence history, because what drew me to it is the same thing that I see in conversations that I have with other people, where you just want to know. It's like, what is the CIA doing? What is the NSA doing? Is it really doing the things that I read in the news? How spooky is it in terms of, how good is it or how bad is it? Some people think the intelligence community either underperforms, or even worse, they have conspiracy theories where it's, a deep state that's maneuvering in the shadows. And we can talk about this certainly, but I found it almost by accident. And I think I've been very lucky, however, because I've approached intelligence studies with, I have friends in the intelligence community. They help me balance my own academic inclinations, the skepticism that I have in intelligence, some of the perhaps more conspiratorial ideas that I originally had about intelligence, with then my own research and what I actually see in terms of what I call civil intelligence relations. And so I think that actually has helped me as an intelligence studies academic, because I don't succumb to some of the biases against intelligence that you see typically among other academics, often journalists as well. But at the same time, I am not, wholly, it's not because I wasn't a former practitioner, I'm not as defensive as a lot of former practitioners are of the intelligence community. So what I like to say is, we had talked about this before. I love boxing, and there's a great famous boxing ref, Joe Cortez, and he would always tell fighters before the fight, I'm fair, but I'm firm. That's how I am in this book is, I think I'm fair to the intelligence community, but I'm also firm in calling balls and strikes and where it went wrong and what it does well.
And so in that respect, I kind of want to start by asking a question that I think plagues a lot of people outside, especially the practitioner realm. How do you reconcile the inherent tension between the secrecy demanded by intelligence work and the transparency required in a democratic society? And what specifically did you discover as a result of your research and looking at the way the intelligence community battled this question for decades or centuries, depending on how early you want to look into it?
That's a fantastic question. What you're getting at is one of the core tensions in civil intelligence relations. And I should just sort of offer a loose definition of that. So civil intelligence relations, to me, kind of like civil military relations, is the relationship between intelligence as a distinct sphere of national security, a distinct profession, a distinct set of organizations, a distinct institution, and its relationship with the rest of civil society, which includes other elements of the US government, the military, diplomacy, law enforcement, but also civil institutions, the media, public perceptions of intelligence. So that's what I mean by civil intelligence relations. And one of the core hearts of it is what you said, which is intelligence is secret, and that just runs against, the American inclination towards wanting to know what their government is doing and feeling entitled to know because it's a democracy. How can we be good voters in a democracy if we don't know everything our country is doing? Intelligence has the imperative to keep secrets about certain things in order to protect us. And so trust is so fundamental to this equation. It's one of the things that I think, and we should talk about this trust in the intelligence community today. Where is it? Is it politicized or not? But, going back to how to balance it, um, it's always going to be a struggle. You can't have too much transparency and you can't have too much secrecy. And so it's a very difficult balancing act, and one that when people ask me, they're like, "Well, how are we doing?" We don't really balance it well. We go too far in one direction and too far in the other.
So, how do we reconcile the 18 intelligence agencies that we have, plus the Office of the DNI, plus the semi-intelligence uh, work done by other non-intelligence agencies with this idea? Is there a watchguard mechanism? Is there a formalized internal structure? We've had the church committee hearings, of course, and what we've had the whole thing with the metadata gathering and whether that's supposed to be private or not. So there's obviously been a long history of trying to figure it out. What conclusion are we at this moment in time?
So there's a lot to this. I mean, that's such an enormous question, and it's actually one I tackle in the book. The size of the intelligence community, how many organizations they are, coordination. So where I would steer this question is towards the issue of coordinating the intelligence community. And so one of the interesting features is notice what we call it. And just for listeners, you'll hear this often. We refer to the US intelligence community or the IC, the intelligence community. Why do we call it a community? You don't refer to the military as the US military community. It's the Department of Defense, the US military, the armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force. So there is a coordinating element there. But it's a community because, as you pointed out, we have all these different organizations. And the interesting thing is there's only two independent organizations in that architecture. The ODNI, as you mentioned, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the CIA. All the other organizations are under a different executive department of government. So, the Army has an intelligence branch underneath it. Department of Energy has intelligence. Treasury has components. Like, in other words, it's a very spread out community. The problem with that is how do you coordinate its work? And so this is one of the constant tensions in American intelligence history is how to coordinate the US intelligence community. And to make this an even bigger problem, do we want to over coordinate? And what I mean by that is for a country like the United States, and this goes back to the last question, where we're worried about secret intelligence organizations and the power of these organizations and whether they're a deep state. If they're too coordinated, then maybe they're too powerful. And that's why they're a deep state, because they're too well coordinated. For the purpose of the readers or the listeners and readers of the book, what you'll see is we're not, even with the creation of the ODNI and the Director of National Intelligence, it's often more of a confederation, and the organizations will fight each other over analysis or operations or access to information. It's not coordination is still one of the biggest problems in the US intelligence community. And as I just suggested, maybe it's better that way. Maybe we don't want too much coordination because then our civil liberties might be more endangered.
So that leads me to another question that tackles the flip side of the coin, and that will lead me to those questions that you touched on about the trust. But this is just as important as the issue of transparency and secrecy, which is to what extent has the American intelligence historically reflected prevailing political ideologies rather than objective threat assessments? And today's situation with Iran is a stark example of that debate and the controversy over that, but it is by no means a novel one.
No, that's a fantastic question, and I'm glad you mentioned it. So, we're already covering themes of the book here: coordination, competition in the IC, and another big one's politicization. Uh, one of the I'm a historian, and so historians hate hearing, again, for the listeners, hate hearing that something's unprecedented. if you tell a historian that something's unprecedented, we're going to go back in time till we find something that looks close enough to be like, ah, something like this has happened before. Well, I'm here to tell you that politicization is constantly happening in U.S. intelligence history. And there's different kinds of politicization, two in particular that I want to highlight. So, what is politicization for the listener? Basically, using intelligence for political purposes. And that can be done from the inside, meaning the intelligence community is distorting its intelligence to manipulate what the policymaker does, or it can be done from the outside, meaning the policymakers, the people not in the intelligence community, manipulate intelligence or how it's done or try and politicize the intelligence community. It also has what I would argue would be like two different forms, and this is what I just previously mentioned. People talk about a lot. This one we know is happening, but we talk about it differently, and that's either you politicize intelligence for policy purposes, meaning, for instance, Iran. The policy is let's go after Iran's nuclear program, and here's the intelligence why we should, or here's the intelligence why we shouldn't. That can be politicized. Or here's the more dangerous piece. We use intelligence for domestic partisan political purposes, meaning the two political parties or the media or whoever, or even from the intelligence community, will use intelligence to try and achieve domestic political goals. That's also happening with Iran as well, because you can sort of see among some people this whole the hawks of the Republican Party want to go to war, so they're going to tell you that Iran had this nuclear program. Or for the people who are opposed politically, will say, well, Iran didn't really have this developing nuclear program, therefore we shouldn't go to war. And if it happens under the Trump administration, then let's elect a different. In other words, you're using intelligence to affect American domestic politics. That's the most dangerous form of politicization. It's also happened all the time throughout American intelligence history.
So, so the people who are claiming that this is only a byproduct starting, let's say, Obama through Trump, and nothing like that has happened previously, and everybody else were saints, of bipartisanship, that that is probably not very accurate. Would it be fair to say that?
Yes. And, in fact, so I'm talking about sort of what I think the most dangerous form of politicization is, using it for domestic political purposes. Well, to go back to what scares us about intelligence, the most dangerous form of that politicization is, imagine the intelligence community being used against elected officials. So unelected intelligence officers, services, organizations meddling with elected American officials. That would probably be the most dangerous form of politicization. It's happened as well. The very famous Alan Pinkerton, some of your listeners might know who he is. He was a detective, and then he became an intelligence officer sort of during the Civil War. He spied on Abraham Lincoln. He talks about it in his biography after the war, on behalf of General George McClellan, who was a personal friend and a political rival of Lincoln's. Not just a general, a political rival. McClellan runs against Lincoln in 1864. So imagine that, using your domestic intelligence services to try and affect political outcomes, and doing it by spying on elected officials. This is the worst kind of politicization, and it has happened in American history. And so when people look at, as you sort of alluded to it, and this is also one of the most difficult things that I had to encounter, or difficult questions, is contemporary politicization issues, because it's so charged, it's polarized our country. So I always fall back on the history. And this is my conclusion, as an American intelligence historian who studied all of it. Anytime that intelligence is used for domestic political purposes, and it doesn't matter what the intentions are of the people who do it, whether they're elected officials, intelligence officers, intelligence organizations, FBI, for instance, or FBI agents, or anytime it's used for domestic political purposes, regardless of the intentions of those involved, it doesn't work out well for the intelligence community, the American people, the elected officials, or the entire country. So I just say, don't do it. Be very careful about trying to use intelligence and knowing that it's affecting political outcomes in the United States.
Now, I have to add a note here that a lot of the time, on the technical level, a lot of the American public and the media seems to have trouble separating what you just described, direct spying on US elected officials or American citizens, from the incidental information that comes up as a result of investigation into foreign entities. And this is
Ah,
not an issue that has been well articulated by anyone, to be honest.
No, you're right. And that's so I have a sort of a different response to that too.
Mhm.
That's also as a product of how we've designed our intelligence system. So who's responsible for doing those investigations? I already mentioned it, the FBI. The problem is the FBI is both a law enforcement organization and a domestic intelligence service. And it wasn't designed that way when it was created by Congress. In fact, I'm sorry, when it wasn't created by Congress, it wasn't designed that way when it was created because Congress at the time, in the this enormous scandal happens. I'd already alluded to spying on members of or elected officials. The Secret Service had been spying on members of Congress during the first decade of the 20th century during the Theodore Roosevelt administration, and Congress found out and the press found out. And there's this article I talk about in the book that says espionage exists. And it was talking about the Secret Service spying on members of Congress, domestic intelligence. So Congress investigates and it says, we want a national law enforcement organization. We need law enforcement. We don't want a domestic spy system. We don't need a domestic intelligence service. So it stops the Secret Service from doing its domestic intelligence role. The problem was the Secret Service was also the only national law enforcement organization really at the time, and the DOJ was using Secret Service agents for its investigations. So even without congressional approval, the Attorney General at the time, Charles Bonaparte, related to Napoleon Bonaparte, incidentally, creates the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it basically absorbs both roles, domestic intelligence and law enforcement. And to, again, this is the fascinating thing about American intelligence history, how it connects. The FBI, when it was the BOI, wins domestic intelligence as a product of competition, bureaucratic competition. And we never really, and this is why I want us as a country to revisit this history, because look at the political scandals that it creates. We never revisited the initial problem posed in 1908 when Congress is investigating the Secret Service. Do we want national law enforcement combined with domestic intelligence? We
Mhm.
just let the FBI win it, and it's been that way since that day. So to answer your question, I know that it sounds like it takes a while to get there with history. Just so I know, there's a reason to read this history because then you can establish these connections really well. When you combine the two, exactly what you said happens, meaning the FBI, it has to do domestic intelligence stuff because that's its job. We don't have anyone else doing it. So if a foreign organization is trying to, let's say, again, co-opt American elected officials or a presidential election or involve itself, well, the FBI is going to investigate it. But it also has law enforcement powers, and that's its first and foremost job. So, in other words, and this happened. This is something that this happened recently when the FBI is investigating. If it speaks to officials, and they lie, well, they just committed a crime. So now the FBI is able to prosecute on top of having its intelligence investigation. And so it's going to be inclined to do that. It's a law enforcement organization. Ultimately, what it wants institutionally, and this is why professionalism is so important, is it wants to prosecute criminals, even more than do domestic intelligence. That's so it combines the two. And when you involve it in something as politically dangerous as investigating elected officials, investigating elections, and you give it both the power of prosecution and the power of investigation and intelligence, you're going to have scandals like this. And the FBI, as a lot of your listeners probably know through J. Edgar Hoover's years, was constantly involved in some pretty borderline politicized in political activities too. So to me, this is something that we need to think about reforming, and it helps to know the history.
So this is a question I've been struggling with for a very long time, and I've been raising it, but haven't gotten any uh, clear response from anybody. And I'm curious what you think. Does it make sense to split the FBI into a federal police and a counterintelligence, counterterrorism agency, kind of like the Scotland Yard and MI5 in the UK?
Bingo. Yeah, I think it does. And here's why. So, first of all, we're an aberration as a common law constitutional country because we actually combine the two. And when you look at, you already mentioned one example, Canada's another example, Australia.
Hmm.
why is it that we're the only common law, and I use my law degree here, why is it we're the only country, among our, I guess, sibling countries, special relationship countries, Five Eye
Five
countries,
Eyes.
who combine the two? There must be a better reason to separate them. I've already given you a couple. So here's another reason to separate them. So what you do then is now you separate the power of investigation and prosecution from the power of intelligence. And what that is, why that's important. Here's a little bit more in the history. Is it's fascinating to me that when the CIA was created in 1947, it was a key piece of debate. Originally, in the legislation creating the CIA, there wasn't anything stipulating that it would not have domestic police powers. Not only intelligence powers, but domestic police powers. People brought that up and they're like, we're going to create a secret intelligence organization, and there's nothing saying forbidding it from engaging in domestic law enforcement roles. So that was
Mhm.
written into the creation of the CIA. So riddle me this. Like, here's my question back
Mhm.
to the listener. Why is it that we created a secret intelligence organization like the CIA and said it can't have law enforcement powers or police powers, but we created a law enforcement organization like the FBI and then gave it domestic intelligence
Hmm.
powers? Because it just does so we trust the law. What it comes down to is sort of the trust thing. We trust law enforcement. So if anyone's going to do domestic intelligence, it should be the glimmering FBI, the G-men, the people who took down John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson, because that was what was happening at the time too. Is it's a law enforcement organization. It gained its prestige with the American public in the 30s, prosecuting and going after organized crime. So let's trust it with domestic intelligence. In other words, to me, there's so many points here that when you reread the history and think about what's happened subsequently and then look at other countries, it just, our design doesn't make sense anymore. And what's wrong with reforming it?
Hmm. I've heard a lot of different suggestions from purging all these institutions to outright closing down, but no one has actually proposed publicly the obvious, which is to change the structure that is causing many of these problems to begin with. Um, so
I can
I
answer that too.
and and actually, while we are on that subject, the very fact of spies or intelligence gatherers and the state, basically they're inseparable in democracy, right? So could you unpack that and explain how it challenges the traditional civil libertarian critiques of intelligence? And we've been hearing a lot more of it recently, but I have a feeling this is also not the first or the last time. And we've had very, very isolationist, skeptical, or intelligence skeptical periods in our history, and the current situation is again by no means new in many ways. The tools that are used to kind of amplify these voices are new, but the actual questions that are raised aren't.
No, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation that you mentioned that because I mean again old is made new. This is the historical problem, which is Americans traditionally. One of the questions I set out to try and prove, not prove, but set out to answer, um, is exactly what you just said, which is there's sort of this running or underlying assumption that the American people have always opposed intelligence. That was an assumption. I mean, I told you I entered intelligence studies with considerable skepticism based on things like the church committee. There's signpost events where you just hear intelligence did this bad, or intelligence can distort things from so you kind of have a conspiratorial attitude towards it. So one of those intelligence studies is there's sort of this mindset the American people have always been skeptical of intelligence. And then I did research and I found that out that's true. For American history, we are generally skeptical of intelligence, generally, except during periods of crisis and war and national emergency. And then it's not that we're skeptical of intelligence, it's that we give it too much responsibility, too much authority, too much
Mm,
trust. And you can't, in a constitutional republic, too, this is something, like you said, civil libertarian, careful about the powers that you give to government because you generally don't get them back. And our
mm,
founders knew that. The founders of this country understood That's why they have enumerated powers, and in the Bill of Rights, they say, and anything not explicitly said in this, they could have said one of two things. Anything in the Bill of Rights not explicitly said, then the
Mhm.
power reverts to the government. They didn't say that. The unenumerated rights go to the citizens, meaning just because it's not written in here, the assumption is it's not a power that the federal government has. So throughout American history, during periods of crisis and war and national emergency, we empower the intelligence community. And oftentimes, especially in the earlier period when there's less oversight too, they do things that are just quite outright unconstitutional. Warrantless search and seizure, warrantless arrest. And then when we find out this is why we don't trust intelligence. We told you, even though the American people supported it. So the fascinating thing that I always say is the American people themselves. And so this is a collective responsibility that we share. In some ways, we have no one to blame but ourselves. We're the authors of our own misfortune. And we have to be careful about this vacillation between giving too much power to intelligence and taking
Mhm.
too much away and being too suspicious of it, because it just doesn't work well. So, where does that bring us today? We're still inconsistent. When I look at polling about intelligence, this is fascinating.
Mhm.
Due to politicization, historically, Democrats were the ones who were more skeptical of intelligence organizations. And for instance, FBI, CIA are the ones that are usually polled. What do you think about the FBI? What do you think about the CIA? Well, due to politicization in the past, 10 years or so, it's inverted where now Republicans are more skeptical about the FBI and CIA. So there's a political piece to public trust and intelligence. However, I'm going to just frustrate your listeners to no end, but then I say, look in the mirror and who's responsible for this frustration. When you poll the public about general trust levels for the FBI and CIA, they usually poll, fairly well above 50%. 60, 70, meaning most Americans, when they're asked, do you trust the FBI? Do you trust the CIA? They do. That's not always historically been how Americans have felt about intelligence. And I think it's a product of recent years, more information. We're still kind of riding the high of the global war on terror and public trust, even though it's vacillated. However, public trust for our own elected officials is lower than our trust in the intelligence community. So this is bad for civil intelligence relations because what it means is we trust unelected intelligence officials who some people will say, well, it's the deep state or the CIA is manipulating stuff. We trust them as organizations and institutions more than the people we elect to oversee them and empower them and give them responsibilities and give them missions. So, I know this sounds like just fantastically complicated. And this is where I say, we as Americans have no one to blame but ourselves for this. This is the polling. This is what we say we feel about intelligence.
Well, this kind of brings us into this whole idea because this whole idea of this struggle with the role of the intelligence in our society, how important people perceive it, how cool they perceive it. And this, of course, been the proliferation of literature and assorted propaganda, cultural propaganda, I would say, not just deliberate political propaganda, and that brings me to the legal aspect of this. How has the US legal and constitutional framework both enabled and constrained the growth of US intelligence, especially since World War II, I would say, in recent decades?
So, I just want to comment for listeners. This is why I love intelligence because, I mean, these are just awesome questions. They're so much fun. They're the same questions I had. One of the things about writing the book is I'm asking questions that everyone has. Like maybe again, I'm a little bit different as far as probably most authors or academics, but as I'm writing it, I'm kind of talking to friends about intelligence, and they ask these questions, and I'm like, I need to think about that as I write that book. I need to address this question.
Hmm.
So, this is a book written for people who have the questions you have. And I'm glad you mentioned the legal aspect because I alluded to this, but I have a law degree I don't use as an attorney. But where it was very valuable was in doing legal research because you learn how to do legal research. I know you also are in the legal field arena. So law suffuses so much of the American national security establishment, especially today. There's always a lawyer involved. But, to your question, here's something that I emphasize early on. Where's intelligence in the U.S. Constitution? I mean, the U.S. Constitution is the foundational document of this country, and it's literally what breathes life into our legal architecture, our legal system. The Supreme Court, since Marbury versus Madison, has been the arbiter, of the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution, and yet intelligence isn't in there. So we've kind of had to struggle and grope our way to developing statutory authorities for intelligence because there's no constitutional foundation for it. And so one of the problems with that is I've even found, I'll just give you an example from the book, for instance. Uh, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, authorizes wiretapping during the Second World War period, just ahead of our involvement. And the reason he does, even though there were some Supreme Court cases, a famous one about Nardone versus United States, saying you can't wiretap, basically, because wiretapping in the 1920s and 30s, when the American people found out about it, like that you can listen to our conversations, was like a huge no-no. And Congress, they're the American people as well, are like, absolutely not. So there's both statutory law and Supreme Court and jurisprudence saying no to wiretapping, essentially. FDR authorizes the FBI to do it. And one of the reasons he said is, well, the Supreme Court wasn't talking, it was talking about law enforcement. It wasn't talking about national security. This is a matter of national security. So that's part of the issue, isn't it? I already alluded to the problems with law enforcement and intelligence. Well, now we see it and the FBI doing both roles because why is the FBI wiretapping? Because the president says, don't worry about what Congress and the Supreme Court say. This is a national security issue. It's a matter of national. So that's the problem is, when something new comes up, we have to look at it and say, well, this is an intelligence issue. How do we apply constitutional law to it? And this is extraordinarily important for this moment in time for the listeners to also understand, because I'm pretty sure when I said wiretapping and people listening, everyone's like looking at their cell phone and thinking, oh my God, who's listening to me? One of the other issues is the Constitution, aside from not having intelligence in it, the Constitution and statutory law in this country just typically don't keep pace with intelligence. Two reasons. First of all, it's very hard to get Congress to enact new laws on complicated things or things that they don't know a lot about or things that require, revisiting the Constitution that could be challenged by the Supreme Court or vetoed by the president. So just making law is difficult, never mind law about intelligence. And the other issue that we've talked about is the issue of secrecy. So the intelligence community has to evolve new capabilities. And even though it's getting congressional funding to do so, it might not be, now Congress is kind of onto the NSA and signals intelligence game. So there's more oversight. But the problem is it's still hard to keep pace with it legally, to establish legal and constitutional boundaries because the IC is like, I need to develop this capability. I need to be able to do this. And I don't want everyone to know that I can do this. So that runs against public awareness. It runs against Congress making new laws about whether the NSA should be able or should not be able to do something or not. And where we saw this happen was after 9/11. Because after 9/11, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that had been used since the 1978 when it was created, and it was created after the Church Committee and hearing about all these secret ways that the NSA is collecting intelligence that also involved collecting on the American people, it didn't keep pace. And so by 9/11, the NSA had capabilities that the people who legislated FISA would never have been able to foresee. And so Congress had to revisit FISA in the mid 2000s after it had emerged that the executive branch had just gone ahead and done, warrantless surveillance that swept up American citizens anyways. So, again, I know this sounds like a lot, but this is why you have to understand the history because it makes you scratch your head when you look at where we are now and say, like, just because we did this back then and then we just kept kind of rolling along, how much do we need to reform the system today?
So I'm going to go on the limb and ask something a little bit provocative, if you don't mind. Do you
Good, go
think the
ahead.
emergence of predictive AI is going to change that and how people imagine future developments, constitutional or intelligence or both, better?
Mhm. Yeah, provocative and timely, and I mean, enormously important today because again, now we're talking about predictive AI. I mean, we're talking about something the founders of this country could have never conceived of, like this capability combined with intelligence. Um, so the I have this. I would say this is where I can point to different periods of American intelligence history and say, the pace of technology is changing a lot. And the American people didn't realize like how much it could be used and how it could be used. In certain respects, the intelligence community didn't realize how capable they were until they started applying, the systems and platforms and that they had. The issue that I have with AI is I, I want us to be balanced. I want us to think carefully about what it is and isn't. And there's a lot of people, you got the doomsayers and the doom scrollers, and then you have the people who are like, well, don't worry, it's still a human algorithm. Um, I don't mind saying I fall more on the side of the doomsayer, not because I'm a doomsayer. I'm not here to say the sky is falling, but because it's better to have that skepticism.
True.
Because this is something like the potential for applications. Well, we've already seen stuff in sci-fi that years ago people said, well, that'll never happen. And then, I read a newspaper article. There's a lot of news articles in the book. That's a lot of the research. And one of them was technology that Americans, and I think it was the 1920s or 30s, I'd have to find it will have 100 years from now. And they have like a wireless headset. Well, that's a cell phone. And they have a self-driving car. And that's, I mean, Tesla. So the thing is in intelligence, they always talk about whatever happens, be careful about failure of imagination. I don't want to have a failure of imagination about the worst case scenario with AI because to me that's more dangerous than having healthy skepticism, like not letting it get out of control. But my concern is, and this is where I also sort of throw up my hands and say, but what else can be done? We're in a intelligence is competitive. We are in a competitive environment, and the US intelligence community isn't just competing against, say, Chinese intelligence or Russian intelligence or Iranian intelligence. It's also competing against and sometimes cooperating with the private sector in the United States. When something becomes competitive, there's nothing to put the brakes on it.
True.
So, in other words, what worries me is we're racing to develop capabilities, intelligence capabilities based upon AI without understanding that we could be racing towards some really potentially dangerous outcomes, but we can't stop it because the answer is, well, what if the Chinese get it first or learn how to do this first? Quantum
Mm.
computing, for example. What if the Russians get it first? Or the US private sector, if they develop something and use it on their own, they have to, do they give it to the federal government or not? Alex Karp has recently talked about this, the CEO of Palantir. So the answer you get from me about AI and its influence, quantum computing is, and this is a historian, in some ways we're entering some unprecedented waters here. And, based on how I've seen intelligence used in the past irresponsibly,
Mm.
my concern is that that's going to happen again. We're not going to know it until it's a little bit too late.
So, in other words, while AI can help imagine scenarios for how you can get ahead, legally and otherwise ahead of the new developments, it can also basically create the new developments that probably open a Pandora's box of things that then invite your adversaries to outrage
Yeah,
you, basically.
exactly. It's cyclical. The funny thing is oftentimes in life, the cause of your problems also becomes the solution to it and then
Mhm.
becomes the cause again. So, AI is looked as a solution to a lot of intelligence problems, sorting through masses of data. I just read a great article this morning on how the NGA is now, it's producing intelligence products that have never been touched by a human being. And they literally put a marking on it to let the policymaker know, this imagery intelligence, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, for your listeners, does imagery intelligence. This product was produced without a human involvement. That sounds pretty good. Oh, this just saved a person who can work on something else. Or for an intelligence analyst, I found the key piece of information out of like tens of thousands, or probably at this point, tens of millions of pieces of information. Now I found the key piece of information that I need to stop a terrorist attack or, figure out that Russia's going to invade you. In other words, let's be creative about what AI could do for us that's good. But think about what it could do for us that's bad. What about AI
Hallucinate.
enabled drones? Right, exactly. So, what about AI that's responsible for, let's just say, like CCTV systems or domestic intelligence operations? What if AI decides, and we've already seen a couple instances, scary instances, where AI is now trying to deceive human operators to prevent it from being shut down. So it's saving itself. I read something also terrifying. I don't mind sharing. About AI drones, possibly having certain targets that they were assigned, and then when they're told not to target them, they target the person telling them not to target them. It was a war game. This didn't actually happen. Like they didn't blow up their own operator type deal. But the point is again, worst case scenario. And oh, by the way, here's the best part, the cherry on top. I remember an article that another friend sent recently. I mean, I really try and stay current. I read as much as I can about the AI stuff, with a degree of surprise, astoundment, and also fear. But it was an AI CEO of a company saying, well, yes, we don't even know all the potential applications or misapplications of this ourselves. So it's like, that's always great to hear. When the person responsible for something is telling you, well, we're not even sure about what the outcome of this development is going to be. So, yeah, that's, I think, our job, though, is don't just point out all the ways it can help us. Think about the ways that it could end up catastrophic for us.
So, circling back to more traditional applications of intelligence, and circling back to this issue of trust with the intelligence, which I think is really key to this discussion on many levels, because the society is really struggling with this issue of trust. In your view, are the so-called quote-unquote rogue agencies are a myth, or are they symptomatic of a deeper misunderstanding of how the intelligence bureaucracy actually functions? And I don't mean just deep state, because I think, first of all, what deep state is varies from country to country. You have the deep state, the shadow state in Turkey, which is a real political thing. Then you have the unelected bureaucrats basically impeding partisan policies
That's
of
right.
elected officials, and that's just the nature of bureaucracy. And then you have this idea of rogue factions that carry on
Mm.
their own subversive agenda, unauthorized by anybody in particular or authorized by whoever. So this is what I'm referring to, not Turkey, but the U.S. context, and this idea of the rogue agency rather than traditional bureaucrats just being bureaucratic.
That's right. That's right. No, these are very, very important distinctions. I'm glad we're bringing up certainly a very timely and sensitive question here. So, my first challenge, and I get questions about the deep state all the time because the first thing people want to know is like, what do you do? I'm like in the airport yesterday, and it's like, well, I was here for this reason and talking about this book, blah blah blah. Intelligence. Oh, what are they really doing? Or now especially, it's more like there's skepticism about a deep state. My first question is like, well, what does the deep state mean to you? Like, who do you think the deep state is? Now, there's a very common association with deep state and intelligence because, again, secrecy, and because your mind kind of just failure of imagination. It's the opposite, is too imaginative, and then it doesn't help when, for instance, the person named after the church committee, Frank Church, Senator Frank Church, says in an interview that he sort of indicates, he says the CIA could be behaving like a rogue elephant. Rogue. So that already throws it out there and it enters people's minds. These organizations, there's not enough oversight. They're responsible for overthrowing governments overseas. So why won't they do it at home? They're manipulating things from the shadows. So there does tend to be an association between deep state and intelligence. However, then there's also what you already mentioned, Irina, which is the deep state is basically entrenched bureaucracy. Entrenched bureaucracy, civil service, not elected officials, and they just do things against the elected government. But then there's overlap because there's the civil service in intelligence organizations, and then the argument is, and that's what the deep state is. So I haven't found, people might not like this answer. I'm going off of what I've researched. I have not found through 250 years of reading American intelligence history, lots of declassified documents, and this is where people will say, well, that's because they keep it classified. Yeah, you'd be surprised what stays classified, what doesn't leak. I haven't found evidence of, truly rogue intelligence organizations. I mean, even the CIA, the whole Church Committee, what it finds out is it was the Eisenhower administration that's behind, we got to do something about communism. You can change this government. Let's try it. I mean, so there was always political, and I mean, outside of the intelligence organizations, support from policymakers for things that the CIA did, for instance, and some of the most infamous things rather, that it did. So I haven't found evidence of like a deep state of intelligence organizations or even a cabal of intelligence officers in those organizations who are out to consistently, especially another question, how long has the deep state been around? Has it always been, a Republican deep state, a Democrat deep state, a deep state deep state? Like, how long has it been around? Who's in it? Are they individuals or organizations? I have too many questions because it's too amorphous a concept. The deep state, ask 100 people what the deep state means to them, you'll get 100 different answers. But if you throw in the term intelligence, it kind of like presents like pathway dependence, and people say, the deep state is like the CIA and the FBI. I haven't found that evidence. The CIA and FBI have fought with each other as often as they've cooperated with each other, and perhaps more so fought with each other than cooperated. So the problem that we have is that's one of the things that I think we need to demystify is that the U.S. intelligence community is a deep state. People can continue to believe what they believe. The problem is, in a lot of ways, I don't try and throw around jargon, so I'll just say it, but it's non-falsifiable. I can't prove that there's not a deep state. So what do you want me to do? Because you're giving me all this evidence that I haven't found and doesn't exist that there is a deep state, and I found a lot of evidence that there isn't a deep state, but I can't prove to you something that can't be proven. So I can only tell you my informed opinion that the U.S. intelligence community is not a deep state. I can say that there's a very famous example somewhat recently, and I do talk about it in the book, and it's unfortunate, but at one point there was a panel on election interference, and there were representatives, former people from FBI, CIA, U.S. intelligence organizations. And at that panel, unfortunately, and again, it's kind of an infamous pronouncement, I would rank it up there with Church saying the CIA is behaving like a rogue elephant. The former acting director of Central Intelligence, John McLaughlin, said, "Thank God for the deep state." And you read this, and I read this as an intelligence historian, and I'm like, "Ugh, you just made my job so much harder." You know what I mean? So,
politicians saying stupid things that has never.
well, and he's not even a politician, but the problem is he was a former member of the intelligence community. He was a former CIA officer. So what does that do to public perceptions of intelligence? That's the problem. Because, and same thing, your listeners probably already can rattle off some of the more famous recent examples, but certain FBI special agents during the investigation of the Trump campaign were communicating very personal, intense political commentary as they were supposed to be involved in this nonpartisan, objective investigation, and it causes you to question the politicization of the entire organization. And so sometimes cliches might help people. One of the cliches I talk about when I speak to like professional military officers or intelligence officers is politicization is the problem, professionalism is the solution. Meaning a professional intelligence officer knows the boundaries of what to say, what not to say, not to be politically invested domestically. I didn't tell you to go into the FBI or CIA. You chose to do that. That imparts professional responsibilities, including the responsibility to be thoroughly nonpartisan in your professional capacity. And again, you chose it. Very careful, even in your personal capacity, meaning your job doesn't leave. I mean, look, you sign non-disclosure agreements when you work for the intelligence community. You have a security clearance. You can't just say, well, now I'm a private citizen, I can do whatever and say whatever I want to. You chose that profession. it has lifetime responsibilities. And so, that's something that I think we need to understand too, which is the professionalism piece is so important for the intelligence community and how they interface with American civil society and present themselves, and therefore how they represent the intelligence community to people.
So here's one problem. There are so many people who are in some ways part of the intelligence community. Let's say somebody is only there for a few years, gets out, starts writing books, goes on a speaking tour for the rest of their life. And at that point, obviously, they haven't spent, their entire life in the intelligence, but yet they always have the title former CIA operative or
Right.
whatever. And and then they use that to advance
Sure.
whatever conspiracy theories, whatever personal political agendas that they want, with the
Right.
credibility of having spent a little bit of time there. And there's no distinguishing between that and a professional career officer who spent a lifetime there and will die taking every secret to the grave, even to the
Well,
point that
I'm laughing because you're saying, writes a book and goes on a speaking tour. And I'm like, that sounds fantastic. Like I'm writing a
it
book. It
does
would be
that.
great to like, I just spend the rest of my life writing books. That's an academic stream. So there's, people will say, I'm going to say the next thing out of envy, but it's not out of envy. Um, there is a problem. Look, the Navy SEAL community has had it too. There's a problem with people who lean on their prior experience and then represent their institutions publicly through what they write and what they say. Again, there is pre-publication review. Things have to be reviewed. The intelligence community, the CIA has a pre-publication review board that reviews what former CIA officers write and says, well, you can't say this. That's still classified. Or, the difficulty is though, there's a boundary where you can lean on your background to represent your own personal views. And that's where I start to say, this is what I talk about when I talk about the professional ethic of civil intelligence relations, civil military relations, military officers in this country. And a lot of them are taught it when they go to professional military education institutions, are taught about civil military norms, meaning this is how I behave even after I leave government. Intelligence doesn't really have a concept of civil intelligence relations.
Hmm.
That's one of the reasons why I can't. Now, again, I kind of am like raising this flag of civil intelligence relations and talking about it. And I use it in the book because I think it's so important because everyone talks about civil mil relations. No one talks about civil intel relations. And arguably, civil intelligence relations have caused tremendous damage to this country in the past 10 years. So why aren't we talking about this more? And part of what we should talk about is training intelligence professionals in civil intelligence norms. So, in other words, they don't go out and write a book that maybe even they don't intend to, but is sloppy in terms of its presentation of civil intelligence relations and produces bad outcomes. Now, the question again becomes a matter of censorship, and we have to be very careful with this. And so I can't tell people, the pre publication review board can tell them, do not write this. All I can say is, this is going to hurt this country. It might help you. You will sell more books. You will be more popular. Whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, you will be on the news more often. Someone will pick this up, a member of Congress, a political party. But what is the damage to civil intelligence relations in this country? And what about professionalism? And what about an ethic behind the path that you chose to do? If you thump your chest about, in the military, again, we talk about this with military officers and even, the enlisted, you talk about, you thump your chest about military service. And then what? You exploit it when you're done? That's not very professional. I think this is part of the conversation that happens that needs to happen within the intelligence community. In other words, when I wrote the book, I'm certainly writing. One of the hardest balancing acts in the book is writing for multiple audiences at once, writing for average American lay readers who just want to understand the same questions I mentioned that we're talking about that my friends have, but also writing for intelligence practitioners and professionals. They need to know their own history too, and a lot of them don't, by the way. Like they're so mired in their daily experience in life that they don't even know whether what they're doing has historical foundations and whether that's a good or bad thing, or at least what's better or what's worse. So and even policymakers as well. The book, I need policymakers to understand how they've legislated intelligence or not legislated it, how they've overseen it or not overseen it. So it's hard to balance that for all audiences. But what I'll say parenthetical to that is one of my points in it is professional intelligence officers should look at some of the examples of in the book of who good intelligence, model intelligence professionals were. I already mentioned one who isn't, Alan Pinkerton, and then a contemporary of his who was George Sharp. George Sharp, who was the director of the Bureau of Military Information, the BMI, the first all source intelligence organization at that point in American history, but it was under the Army. He didn't write a book when he got done. And that's actually something that distinguishes him because Alan Pinkerton and another rival of Pinkerton's, Lafayette Baker, both published memoirs. Hey, look at what I did during the Civil War. And even Pinkerton talks about spying on Lincoln. Baker spies on Johnson as president of the United States. Now, Johnson was in many ways a corrupt president, but still, do we want intelligence spying on presidents, no matter how corrupt or non? This is very dangerous. And so there's something there for intelligence practitioners to understand about what should be their norms of behavior and professional standards, not just when they're in the intelligence community, but when they leave as well. Sorry, these are long answers because one, it's a long history, and two, they're big questions. These are big questions of our time.
So that leads me to another big question. Can secretive intelligence operations ever truly be subject to democratic oversight? Or is this notion fundamentally at odds with operational secrecy? And what I mean is, we had the whole hullabaloo about the alleged Snowden revelations. Why I'm so annoyed by this whole story is that I studied the metadata program in law school 3 years prior to Snowden becoming anybody. Clearly, it was public knowledge, just not wide public knowledge. It was knowledge for professionals who were studying national security law. That information was available. It was just not widely known.
Yeah.
And basically Snowden publicized it. But along with publicizing one controversial element that was already public knowledge for professionals, he also revealed secret intelligence operations, and that was the real problem with what he did. And of course, that's not what the media focused on at all. They all praised him for revealing the worst kept secret in history.
Right. Well, no, so that's the other thing too. Look, people say it all the time, and it is kind of cliche, but it's also kind of true. We don't always keep secrets well. The president's surveillance program that I kind of alluded to earlier, the post 9/11 program to do surveillance, that leaked very quickly to the press. The George W. Bush administration, though, also went to the New York Times and said, you can't publish this. This program is too important to national security. And the New York Times withheld it for a few years because, well, it's post 9/11. Everyone's scared of the next terrorist attack. And so they did. And then they eventually published it. Dana Priest talks about this, published prolifically early on about surveillance and global war on terror programs, interrogation, et cetera. It makes the news pretty quickly. And if you read between the lines, if you know what to look for, you can kind of see what capabilities are. And then, look, everyone has this assumption, well, the NSA is spying on me anyways. And so I see a sort of, I don't mean this in a bad way, but laziness, constitutional laziness there. And here's what I mean by that. Okay, so your assumption is, well, the NSA is going to spy on me anyways. They probably know what I'm saying. That's fine for you, but does that mean I want them to? So in other words, what's good for the goose isn't necessarily good for the gander. And a lot of times I do ask this question in the beginning of the book, how much liberty would you trade for your security? But the better question is how much of someone else's liberty would you trade for your own security? And we're very good at making that decision for other people. Yes, infringe on their rights, just don't infringe on mine. But the problem that I go back to when I deal with people who tell me like, well, I have nothing to hide and they probably spy on me anyways, and they're going to regardless is, okay, well, that doesn't mean that other person wants to be unconstitutionally surveilled. And the other issue is it still violates the law of the land. In other words, if it's truly unconstitutional surveillance, and these are the questions that we have to tease out. How intentional was it? Metadata, like, is that within the Constitution? Like, is it incidental, intentional? If you know that it's happening, does it then become intentional and therefore it is unconstitutional? these are enormously important questions. But I say like, so just because your running assumption is it happens doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it American. It doesn't make it principled. So let's be a little bit more skeptical of that. And your original question was on secrecy and oversight. Unfortunately, I will say that in throughout the book, will show you the ways that you have to be careful with congressional oversight because it just never turns out to be what people think it's going to be. Like once we have congressional oversight, everything's going to be okay. We're going to be able to make sure these kinds of scandals don't happen again. That was the whole design of the church committee is now we're going to have permanent congressional oversight committees and that we won't have a repeat of church committee scandals. It's happened anyways. Because part of the problem is Congress is reflective of the American people, and when the American people are afraid, Congress is pretty deferential because they want to be reelected. They also tend to be deferential to the president or more deferential during periods of war. This is a tradition, although politicization makes that more difficult. And the other thing is, this has been always been true too, is usually members of Congress want to know enough that they can say, I knew. It wasn't like I wasn't watching. Trust me, I am overseeing the intelligence community, but not enough that they can get in trouble for the particulars. So we've seen that a few times, and that certainly happened during Global War on Terror, where it's like, we have oversight of the intelligence community. And then it's like, well, so you knew about enhanced interrogation or torture? And it's like, no, 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 no. We didn't know about that. But it's who funded CIA black sites? Who funded, everything gets funded in this country. So the question is so they'll say we weren't, fully and currently informed. I was not fully and currently informed. That's the note card they give you when you find out about an intelligence scandal and you're a member of Congress. What do I say? Oh, something bad happened. I wasn't fully and currently informed. Why did you ask? Or you should have you should have done more homework. And so we talked about reform. I think congressional intelligence oversight needs to be reformed in this country. Whether it's a single joint committee like the original committee on atomic energy, I think the joint committees tend to be more bipartisan. And also members of Congress should be only responsible for intelligence. If they're on an intelligence committee, that should be their only responsibility because it's too big a job. It's too important to be constantly looking at other elements, but that might be a lot to ask for a member of Congress. And, the literacy of the people who are on these committees, it can vary, how much experience they have with the intelligence community. Are they too close to the intelligence community and therefore too trusting or too far away and too conspiratorial? Are they too politicized, meaning they're going to wield intelligence that they hear for political purposes? Again, I'm writing for multiple audiences, and one of them is Congress has not always been a very faithful steward of the American people's intelligence community.
So that also leads me to another related problematic question, which brings us to today in some ways, which is what role did the Cold War play in institutionalizing a permanent intelligence infrastructure? And how do
Hmm.
you think that legacy still shapes US democracy today? And actually, is the fact that the Cold War shaped so much of our intelligence infrastructure a problem for the way we are dealing with contemporary intelligence problems? For instance, we have this recent controversy over the US intelligence community or some representatives of that community claiming that Iran was not, in fact, developing a nuclear program. What does that
Right.
mean? And how would that have been handled during the Cold War? And
Ah.
so, yeah.
Sure. Well, the Soviets did develop a bomb early in the Cold War, and it became a scandal because the CIA was only a few years old, and basically the CIA was blamed. Like, why didn't you tell us? And the CIA is like, well, we did tell you. We just got the date wrong because the CIA said anywhere from 1950 to 1953, with their consensus being the Soviets will have a bomb by 1953, and then it happened in August 1949. And so people blame the CIA, but they're like, well, we can't always guarantee we'll get the exact time right, but that's the expectation. Uh, the Cold War was formative for the American intelligence community in many ways, particularly because, you kind of entered uncharted territories in the sense of you knew you had, at the end of a major war, traditionally in American history, we're like, all right, the war is over. We can go back to peacetime. At the end of the Second World War, there was consensus. Everyone knew by the end of the Second World War, or should have known, the Soviet Union is going to be a serious rival, if not outright threat. And we knew also from Pearl Harbor, congressional investigations into Pearl Harbor were happening during and after the Second World War. The sense of we can't be complacent again. And then the way the system evolved, it was so we need permanent intelligence organizations that are going to stay, extraordinarily proactive, as opposed to where we kind of would rein in intelligence in other wars in American history. After the war is over, we either get rid of the intelligence organization. I mentioned the Bureau of Military Information, BMI, that was gotten rid of
Mm-hmm.
after the Civil War. It's like, no, we're not going to get rid of them, and you have to stay watchful. And then other things during the Cold War entrenched that, meaning we have to constantly watch the Soviet Union's military to see if they're preparing a surprise attack. We have to constantly monitor their nuclear armaments to see where they are in development and whether they're going to launch a surprise nuclear attack and destroy us before we can destroy them, and we'll just destroy the world in the process. So the Cold War really did solidify a lot of the American intelligence community, not just the system itself and certain organizations that were created, CIA. I go through a lot of the ones that are created in the Cold War. CIA, NSA, DIA, NRO. It didn't only solidify that, but it also changed during the Second World War. It changed the American mindset about the need for permanent intelligence organizations that are constantly going to be busy spying. And so, there was a mindset change there. But you made a larger point too on solidifying it, and I would use the term even ossifying it, where it can start to just like become brittle and decay over time. So one of the questions I tease is so we created a lot of these organizations, and we created this community, and even the term U.S. intelligence community was first used in the early 1950s. There's a debate over who used it and where, which I talk about again in the book, but just because we did it for the Cold War doesn't mean it needs to stay that way today. We can look at each organization and they each have a distinct responsibility and they can tell you why that's important. Do we need as many? Do we need to combine some? They need to be under a department, a single department? Why do we have a Department of Defense? We don't have a Department of Intelligence. That would coordinate things better, probably, if instead CIA is by itself and NSA and NRO and NGA are under the DoD and FBI is under the Department of Justice. Put them under a Department of Intelligence, right? So the Cold War is a fascinating period, and I talk about it in terms of the creation of the secret national security state. And I also established that there was context behind what we did there. And so just because there was context at that point in time that made it sound wise or good or reasonable, we need to reinvestigate that and say, it happened at that time in that place. Is that still applicable under the same terms today? I'm not trying to be evasive to that answer. What I'm saying is I'm in agreement that the Cold War was very important and foundational for what we see in the structure of the intelligence community today and a lot of the biases. And the question is that structure and system still going to work for us in a way that we think is advantageous for American national security, given the different types of challenges and threats and even opportunities that we have today?
Oh, I know we have to run in a few minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up with with a single question that incorporates some of the major concerns, which is essentially there's this idea that failure is not exceptional in intelligence, but rather structural. What does that mean for how policymakers and the public should evaluate intelligence performance, especially given that failures are often public, whereas successes are often hidden and not publicized? And there's again returning to that theme of public trust. How can they even trust agencies when they don't often publicize their successes?
I had that conversation with intelligence officers where they allude to very successful intelligence operations, and in some cases we've seen that happen. So for instance, early global war on terror, there were a lot of plots. The question is how concrete were they? How impending were they? But from what you would hear, the U.S. intelligence community prevented a lot of terrorist attacks. The question is then the specificity with which they tell you how they did and what they did. And how impending the attack was. So the problem again, and you said it, and I do think so. It's something that JFK said about the CIA. Your failures are heralded, or your failures are trumpeted, and your successes are unheralded. And so my challenge to the intelligence community is then, if that's the case, declassify more. I mean, I get it. You have to protect sources and methods, but you also have to balance that against public trust in what you do. Why is it that the public is expected to trust the intelligence community, but the intelligence community, you know what I mean? It's like, trust us. You almost hear that implicitly in some things where it's like,
Mhm.
we know this is happening. How do you know? I can't tell you, but trust me. That doesn't work, or it will only work for so long, and it won't work if what you see more of is the times they were wrong, or the boy who
Mhm.
cried wolf, or the failures. And so, they need to balance their transparency as well. In other words, prove it. If look, don't just say I can't, or the failures are trust me, we have a lot of successes. Prove it, or continue to labor under the same problem of civil intelligence relations, which is you will be more judged by your failures than your successes. If the intelligence community and intelligence officers and policymakers are comfortable with that, then they also have to explain that as well. Is you know what? And I mean this when I talk to intelligence officers. There's a very famous poem by Rudyard Kipling called Tommy, and it's about the British soldier Tommy this, Tommy that, throw him out the brute, but it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot.
Mhm.
If you're an intelligence officer and you can bear the quiet pride of knowing what your successes are and being judged by the public for your failures, then that's the game you're in. You have to accept that professionally. And in some ways, that's going to be the plight of American intelligence. I think to a certain extent, due to secrecy, due to norms, we will, and due to the tenor of media and what the American public, it's funny because we almost want to see failures. Like it's almost like perverse in some ways, like that we want to see failures because it sort of vindicates what we think about intelligence, or why don't we want to? We should see successes, but this is a balancing act. And so this is where I challenge the intelligence community to do a better job with truly declassifying information, being more transparent with the American people. And the last thing I'll say on this is a lot of times the failures emerge due to leaks, due to press reports, due to FOIA, or in other words, it's forced on the intelligence community to expose what they did wrong, controversies. Instead, and this is the point of the CIA family jewels. Colby, he's like, tell me all your sins, just write into me. And CIA officers are saying, well, we did this, and I don't think we should be doing this. This is intelligence officers reporting things they thought they were doing wrong. That's important. And then Colby takes it to Congress and, it says, okay, mea culpa, we did a lot of stuff we should have done. That is sort of remarkable because a lot of times we only learn about failures not because the intelligence community is transparent and says, "Hey, we need to let you know we're doing something and we messed up," but because it's almost forced out of them. So I think hearing that the failure is raising your hand and taking responsibility is just as important in terms of that failure to success balancing. It's just as important for the intelligence community to be more transparent when it does do things that are controversial or there's a failure. So again, I guess the best way to conclude is sort of how we started, which is, when people ask me like, what's the point? Like, what are you looking for? Um, it's a balancing act, and we haven't really balanced things well. And when you read American intelligence history, you see where we haven't and why. And then when you keep seeing certain things happen over and over again, by the time you get to the present day and you see stuff that you're like, well, I've seen echoes of that before, that's when you tell yourself like, we can do better. It's just a matter of learning this history and, the intelligence officers doing better in their jobs, members of Congress doing better in their jobs, the American people being more self-reflective of when they support intelligence and when they don't, and offering too much support or too little, or politicizing intelligence. So, this is a history of American intelligence, which means all of us, our intelligence community. It's not just the spy in the state, it's the spy, the state, and the American people, like I like to say. So I hope that addresses that phenomenal line of questions that you've had.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. I have there's a million things I could discuss with you, and I hope to continue this conversation at some point as well. But for now, I hope everyone who's been watching this program will get a copy of your book, The Spy and the State, and reads it and discusses it widely. I think it warrants a lot of very thorough discussion. And for everyone watching the program, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great evening.
Thank you.